My name is Jing Su. Welcome. I'm Chair of Council on East Asian Studies. And today I am especially pleased and honored to be introducing you a very special guest, actually two, although only one will be speaking. And that is Ms. Zhang Xin, who is the CEO and co-founder of SOHO China. Many of you know that SOHO China was founded in 1995 between Ms. Zhang Xin and her husband, Pan Shiyi, who actually will not be speaking today. This is actually quite an extraordinary, I think, corporate story as well as a personal story. Ms. Zhang Xin came from actually a very humble background, and she wrote quite poignantly about it in an op-ed in 2014 in the New York Times, where she recounts actually working her way at the age of 14 in Hong Kong in a factory. These are the things that we read about for a few years before she then found her way to England to a secretarial school. And since then, it's been a steep climb upwards. And one of the most memorable things I remember from reading that piece was the new coinage of PhD. She remembered that they were poor, hungry, and determined. I hope my own PhDs in the audience might take note of that. This is quite an extraordinary tale, and it's only started there, because since then, the SOHO China has actually been a major mover in philanthropy. They started small, I think, building education in schools in Western China, where actually Mr. Pan is from. But from then, they built out a global vision outward. And years later, they've also actually over the years contributed to tsunami relief in Asia, 2004, the Sichuan earthquake in 2008. So many of these series of larger and ever-growing humanist visions about what they could do. And it is really our true honor to have been a beneficiary, actually, of their largesse, because in 2014, Ms. Zhang and Mr. Pan decided to pledge $100 million to aid undergraduate education for Chinese students in particular who otherwise would not have this opportunity. And these are students not from Beida or Tsinghua. I'm happy to say that these are students that truly will benefit and I think have a kind of drive and determination that I have not seen elsewhere to succeed and to build out their vision as well. So it is really a tremendous pleasure to have them here today. And Ms. Zhang will be speaking quite formally with you. Our format is as follows. We will first show a short clip about SOHO China, when some of you may have not seen. And from there on, we'll have Ms. Zhang give her talk, her conversation, and then we will have Professor Deborah Davis, who's my colleague and a member of Council on East Asian Studies in Sociology, who's written 10 or so books on contemporary China, society. Her latest book is actually on love and romance and all kinds of things that could go wrong. And she will be the interlocutor with Ms. Zhang. And while that is happening, I should alert you to the green cards that are on your table. While they're having their dialogue, please write down your own questions if you have any, and someone will come around to collect them, and we will present them in that fashion. So without further ado, I think we will begin with a short clip, and then we'll move on to Ms. Zhang. Thank you.
This is a tremendous pleasure. And I think I mentioned to you that my students, both in the freshman seminar and in the seminar on creating wealth and poverty, read the interview that you did with Miss Jia, who has also been
at the New Yorker?
Yes, the New Yorker one. And also the interview you did with Leslie Stahl. Okay. So those who have come from my class, I think are familiar with some piece of it. I don't think that the students have, at least the ones I've known, have seen this most recent spectacular video of your new building. And I think when we emailed, you said you wanted to say something about the role of design and architecture as part of the driver of your innovation. And I was wondering if you could expand on that.
So the video just showed, and you could see that we selected a few projects that are, all of them were built in the last 20 years. Actually, most of these are showed in the recent projects, probably mostly built in the last 5 years. And that's really the tremendous urbanization we have seen in China in the last 20 years. And when we started out building SOHO China, there was hardly any urbanized part of the city. And so in the last 20 years, when cities like Beijing and Shanghai, you see all these amazing buildings being built. And I think the role that we played was to introduce the most innovative designs from all parts of the world and brought them to China. And those designs some of them were designed by architects from the States, from Europe, from other parts of Asia. And we wanted to bring all these incredible talents in China's urbanization. And that's such a character of our today's life, which is a globalized world. And so that's what you saw. And very different from, if any of you had been to China 20 years ago, the buildings were very different from this kind of design.
Do you want to say more about how the buildings have shaped people's experience or their expectation? As you've talked about these extraordinary buildings, they really are they're like artworks. They're spaces. I mean, they're functional, but there's also, as you watch the video, it's a source, it's a driver of change on the ground. And I was wondering if you wanted to speak about what's happened once the building is there. Have you started to see changes around the building and inside the building?
So when we started out building buildings, early on, very quickly we realized these buildings are going to be there for so long. They will outlive all of us. We very early on discovered the character of architecture is that it really records the culture of the time. Like today, if you go to China, you go to visit the Great Wall. You go to the Forbidden City. At the time, it was all built for different purposes. Great Wall was built for defense, and Forbidden City was built as a palace. But today, they serve as a glimpse, a window of our ancient history. And now, what we're building today will, in the next 50 or 100 years, serve that purpose of the people who come in to see. So early on, I had, our firm were very, once we realized this is the character of architecture, we search around and see what really is the character of modern age. And then we identified there are two things that actually affects all of us. One is globalization. The other is digitalization. So in this globalized world, which is a little ironic today, right after the election to talk about globalization, at least 20 years ago, we were so excited to be able to create a platform for talents around the world to come into China to work. And I remember when I first contacted some of these architects, many of them had never been to China. I used to go to exhibitions around the world, and always when I go to see an exhibition, And I asked myself, this is a great architect. Can I bring this person, can I bring she or him to China? Would they be able to adapt to China? And so that was the exciting thing about doing a real estate development, is to bring these talents. And also another thing is, these buildings you saw, they wouldn't have been able to build 50 years earlier. It wasn't because of computerization. It wasn't because of 3D modeling. None of that would be able to build. In fact, a lot of these fluid-shaped buildings, right, even 10 years ago, was not possible to build them. Those were the days when you used to have to draw on paper, and very hard to realize these fluid-shaped. But today, with the computerization, digitalization, you are able to do this. So we were early on just to know that whatever we build, we must include these two characters of our time. And that's why all of our buildings have these two elements. As early as buildings that we built 20 years ago, we were able to bring the talents from other parts of the world and come. And then along the way, wherever the technology gets to, we're able to tap in, and we're always asking, can this technology be adapted to what we do? And can we build more efficiently? Can we design differently with this? Now, China being China, projects of such a massive scale, we are able to realize these things in a way that architects 10 years ago never dreamed of be able to do this. And so that's what I think it's exciting. It's also, and when you look at the cities urbanized in a very short period of time. Today, we don't live in a time when it takes 100 years to build a city. Today, really, a city in China mostly are built in 10, 15, 20 years. The majority of the urbanized part is built. So then, in this very short, it's because our production technology allows us to do this. Today, actually, if you look at China, it's largely built. There is major cities, not so much land still available, and cities already been defined, city centers already been defined, the landmarks of each city is already been defined. It's like, the face of the city has already been built. So that was, it was an exciting thing about last 20 years.
I want to ask that, return to this question again another way, and share what my visit to one of the buildings. In 2008, Yale had this exchange with Beida, and we would go, faculty and students, and it was co-teaching. And the course I taught was on urban space, and how urban space was used and how it varied over time period. So the students spent the semester investigating. But one time I took them downtown to your building that was just opening then, which was, I understood it, what the concept you wanted to bring was living and working in the same place. So that was, that cluster of buildings, not as large as what we just saw, and so it was built 10 years ago. And that's why I asked the question about what are some of the consequences of building these extraordinary sculptural spaces and places. Do you see different kinds of interactions in these buildings than you see in the more traditional building? Is that one of the things that motivates you to do this extraordinary innovation?
I think cities, architectural space really affects the way we live, the way we work, right? I mean, we come into this space, you would have one way of thinking about, you'll behave in certain ways. Yeah. And if you go into another space, let's say a very, different from this, a very modern space, you naturally will behave differently. So I think, but I'm not advocating to say that we should only build modern and destroy the old, and we should work just as much to conserve the old architecture as much as we build the new ones. Because the great thing about variety is that you have different types, and that suits different purposes. So that's perhaps when you mentioned that, at one point what we did was the company called SOHO. It's small office, home office. So at one point we were building these buildings that are half working, half living. And I think, I don't know if many of you remember back in year 2000, it was the first wave of internet. And I remember that year 2000, I was invited to speak at the Harvard China Forum. And it was the peak of people's excitement of wanting to do startups, doing internets. And I remember our session that talked about China's urbanization had about 5 people came. Nobody wanted to listen to what we were talking about. But next door, there were hundreds of people showed up, and they couldn't even get into the rooms. And so I was really depressed and thinking, this is really bad, you know, no one pays attention to what we do, right? But I think back home, right away we were thinking, so we must be missing something, that if the world is moving towards what the people's excitement is, and building must also adapt to fit that. So then it was just at the point where people were talking about, oh, you know, in the future, people are not going to be going to the office to work. They want to work and live together. So then we started thinking about, so can we come up with a product, half working, half living? So that's how small office, home office, SOHO, small office, home office, SOHO came because of that. So in a way that in this last 20 years of working, we were constantly thinking about what we're doing needs to adapt to the need of the society, to the need of the market. And that was a small story, but actually that didn't last very long, because very quickly the bubble bursted, and you know, people went back to work in the office. And so these kind of a half-working small office, home office, all turn into small office. You know, all become small office, not home office.
Right. I was wondering, what has been the impact on, obviously we're in the United States, but also perhaps of Europe or Latin America. Has SOHO, the buildings that you have created, but also the others that have been built in this last 20 years, do you see them starting to have an influence on builders and urban planning outside of China?
Actually, this is early on when we were building buildings. It was just when China began the development, there was just such a need to upgrade the infrastructure, to move into better residential homes, better offices, right? And so that the focus was on building. And I don't know if you noticed that in the later half of the video, we moved to co-working space, which is what's happening now. So what happened is, once you build these buildings, then what is the content in the building became more interesting. Right. And we also, again, you know, we're asking ourselves, what is today's need? And when we see these sharing economies happening all over the world, like, you know, today you share taxis, you go to Uber, and you share hotels and homes, you go to Airbnb. And so we were thinking about, so what is the working environment that is the answer for this sharing economy? And especially in China, where there's so many startups, there's so many small companies. The model of a company needs to come in, rent a few floors, sign a long lease, and renovate themselves, and then move in hundreds of people. It fits certain type of companies, but it doesn't fit into the small startups. Then we thought, okay, we have to do something about the startups. Already, China was we saw these kind of incubators happening. So we thought, okay, incubators is about investing in these companies, startups. We don't want to be investors in those because we don't understand what they do. We don't have a good judgment on that. But we can provide office space. So about 2 years ago, we launched this SOHO 3Q, which is what you saw is basically you come in, it's like a Starbucks. You just bring your computer, your cell phone, and everything is provided. There's lecture rooms, actually a Yale business school style of lecture rooms. We built one. And then you can have event areas that, because often these companies need to promote themselves all the time. You can rent a desk, you can rent 3 desks, 10 desks, or you can rent a room that with 5 desks or 50 desks. So we came up with this new product. Again, this is our thinking about what is the answer for sharing economy. And we opened one in Shanghai, one in Beijing 2 years ago. Right away, it got filled up. And we realized that the need is so much and so strong. So we decided all of the SOHO buildings, we will build one. So by now, we've already got 16 centers, SOHO 3Q centers in Beijing and Shanghai. So pretty much if you're in Beijing and Shanghai, in any district, you will be able to find a SOHO 3Q and you can just move in. And today it's become the hub of these high-growth internet companies. And we host many companies like Uber China before they merged with Didi, or many others like Leshi or Meituan. These are high-growth internet companies, and we host all of them. So it's been an exciting journey to see that new product. So we, as a company, will continue to think about, how do we continuously to reinvent ourselves that fits the need of the time.
One of the things that struck me, I first went to China in 1979, so you can see what the trajectory has been. Extraordinary, right? But last year when I was working in Shanghai for the year, what was transformed my life yet again was Weixin. And I was wondering how that has impacted both these incubator areas where people move in, or more generally. And the reason I ask is what Weixin does in a way that Facebook, Twitter do not do, is provide this extraordinary digital, really abstract space in which people connect in real time, pictures, ideas, thoughts, and it creates a freedom and an intensity of life which I found decidedly different than 2 years before. So what I'm talking about is that China is moving very, very fast. The urban pace is undoubtedly the fastest in the world. These huge million-person cities, of which I think the US has, I can't remember, we have 50, and UK has 4, and China has 180. China's in a different place in terms of how they're developing the urban space, the scale on which they're building it both up and out. But this Weixin piece is, in a way, seems to be almost moving orthogonal to it. It has a deepening to it. And I was just curious, as a person living, working, and creating the new urban space, whether you also find the Weixin revolution as revolutionary as I have.
I think all of us in China can't imagine live without Weixin today, right? Like, if you're not on Weixin, you're unable to connect with people, right? And we also bring Weixin to what we do. So, like, increasingly, actually in the US, people are still using a lot of emails. China is becoming less and less email-driven, and more, communication move to Weixin. A lot of the service are also what we do is provide on Weixin. Customer service and service, all provided on Weixin. So it's very easy to connect people through Weixin inside our office space. So not just people are using Weixin to connect with friends, families, but also work. We, through management, we use Weixin. Today our conference calls are on Weixin. One of the things that Mr. Pan and I here allowed us to be here to do our fellowship at Harvard is because we continue to use Weixin to monitor the company and continue to work with the distance. It's been a tremendous tool to help the management.
I know you've spent today with our students, faculty, and I was wondering if you have some reflections at this point on the day. Were there some surprises in your visit today? Were there things that, I know you've visited before, so I was wondering if you saw something different today than in your previous visits?
Well, today is a special day, right after the election, and we had the honor of meeting the SOHO scholars here. We through providing financial aid, we have SOHO scholars at Yale, at Harvard, doing undergraduate degrees. So today we met with a few Yale scholars, many of them sitting here. I was most impressed by, first of all, how engaged these scholars are with the U.S. politics, with the U.S. society, and many of them are first-year freshmen. And so I was really impressed, because I reflected on back in the 80s when I was an undergraduate student. I was about the only Chinese student in the entire university doing undergraduate. And just today, the sheer number of Chinese students is just different. And also, I was, most of the time I couldn't understand English, couldn't speak English, and let alone to really understand what was going on with the society. So just hearing the freshman students are so engaged and so involved and really taking it to the emotional level, it's in a way really moving to see how Yale obviously has been a platform to integrate the Chinese students in. And also it reflects on how open China has become. In many ways, these students before they came, they were able to speak incredibly good English. So it's not like the days when I was a student, I was really struggling with learning English and learning the academics. And here, they don't have the language barrier. And so it gave them a really different entry point of the society. But it was also interesting to see how, as you and I, exchanged that, many of the students are first time witnessing so closely democracy, and the idea of the candidate you support can lose is unusual. It's unusual, and but I guess for Americans who experience this every 4 years,
every 2 years,
it's nothing that unusual. Even though this election is a very unusual election, but I still think that the impact on the Chinese students was probably even more profound than someone who grew up in democracy.
Would you also like to reflect, more broadly, we were talking about this on the email, those things that you feel the American students, and here was the Yale students, what should they be particularly paying attention to about China? What are you've given us this extraordinary video of your new buildings. China's futuristic to many Americans, and is that if you were to say to an American audience, there are 3 things I want you to remember about China today, would it be primarily the urban revolution? Is that what is the first thing you'd want to do?
I was reflecting, on my way here and thinking, 3 years ago, when we first came to Yale to talk to the president about this scholarship, who would have thought where the world is today, right? At the time, it seemed to be any effort to push globalization is a positive and great effort. And yet today, seeing this kind of rejection of globalization happening at the global scale, this is not just in America, but all over the world, it is also the moment to reflect on why is it there's so much discontent? Why is it, so this is not one or two people, hundreds of millions of people are not happy with this. Now, should we be losing sight and losing hope on globalization? Or should we take this as an opportunity to reflect and adjust and do better? I think that's something I took away from this election, and I took away from the Brexit. I took away from many of these rejections around the world. And Mr. Pan and I are doing a fellowship at Harvard this year. Funny enough, the topic we're interested in is globalization. So I was we are auditing Larry Summers' course on the future of globalization. So I went to talk to Larry and ask him, how does he feel about it now? And Larry said, he said, if you were to read the speeches I made or President Clinton made back then when they were supporting China joining WTO, there was an underlying assumption that when China joined WTO, China's will be doing more trades with other countries in the world that would inevitably open the Chinese society, connecting with the world better. Therefore, by then, politically it will be more open, society will be more open, democratic society typically would follow with economic prosperity. And he said, but today, it is an interesting time to see that it hasn't happened as they assumed. Another professor at Harvard who also focuses on globalization is called Daniel Roderick. And he focuses on the potential problems of globalization. So not just the benefits that we've been hearing and hoping for, which we see also, but also the potential trouble that it involves. And I think what we're seeing is what he has been talking about for years. And finally, I think he's got an audience to listen to what he has been researching and finding. But really, I think any setback is a moment to reflect and to adjust rather than to give up. And so myself, continue to think that if we were to think about what's in my lifetime, what's the greatest thing we've witnessed is globalization, is to see China opening up. And I continue to hope that it'll be, we will continue to be on this path for a much longer time.
I think we had said after about half an hour, we're going to start to collect the questions. So if those of you in the audience who would like to ask Ms. Zhang a question, please write it on the green paper that's there. And then she's going to look through and see, because there may be duplicates or there may be ones that lead one question to another, and she'll respond to that. So while you're doing that, we'll continue chatting. I guess maybe I would want to see if maybe we could, while they're doing their questions, we might reverse it. Is there a question that you would like to ask me as the...
these are your
some are
East Asia?
No, today there are a variety. How many students are undergraduates? Could you raise your hand?
Oh,
so these are our undergraduates. How many of you are in graduate students in Faculty of Arts and Science? And how many of you graduate school in law school? You can say the law school. Public health, medicine. Do we have anybody from that? Yes, we have some from that part of the campus. How about art and architecture? Music. Do we have any graduate students from music here today? There are some students from China in graduate school, but you can see that what you have generally are, I think, the largest group are our undergraduates, and then a selected from almost all the other schools. So I doubt there are many whose area is East Asian Studies. Clearly, if they're taking one of my courses now, they're in a class that's focused on China. Right. But their own majors are probably as diverse as all. I mean, we have science, engineering, humanities, social science. So, and let me see, how many of you are from Beijing? So you can see this is the Beijing number. How many are from Shanghai? Okay. How many from Guangzhou? Yes, we have a few from, how many from, this is for Yale because of Yale China. How many people are from Changsha? We don't have, how many people are from Hunan? Do we have a Hunan group? In some years we have a Hunan Bang. We will have a whole group from Hunan. So the students will come from many parts of China and not just the major largest cities, and they'll have a varied background.
Well, lots of questions.
Yes, I'm sure there are lots of questions.
Okay, so I don't know if I can answer so many.
No, you choose the ones you choose the ones you wish.
All right, this is the one that's really good. Can you speak to the state of a women's right in China today, especially in high levels of leadership, business? I think for us, Chinese living in China, we all see two parts of China on these women issues. On the one hand, you go to rural China, where some families still don't want girls. That's why you hear these horrible stories of, abandoning baby girls, and therefore, the ratio between men and women have been artificially, distorted. That's a horrible story. So that's giving the picture of women's rights. What right is that if you don't have a right to live, right? So that's one side. On the other hand, you have the urban side of China, which is most families have one child, and girls are just as precious as boys. And then I think that urban China today, I would even think that in business, particularly in private business, women tend to do really well. And I would say women tend to do better than many other very developed economies. And why? Because Chinese economies are younger, companies are younger. The structures of the business structures are not as set. If you were today to go into join Wall Street bank, there's such a structure of how you need to work your way up, and there's just certain paths you have to follow, and it doesn't change overnight. Whereas in China, so many of these companies are young and fresh and just started 5 years ago. And so I find that because of the nature of the newness, it gives women a tremendous opportunities. And you see women in private sector business do really well, generally do really well. Now, not so much with government areas like state-owned sectors, state-owned companies, or typically you just don't see as many. Again, it goes to a very structured tradition that needs to go through a certain path that are just not as open for women as it is from private sector. So that's on women, and oh gosh, so many. Do you want to go through a few? I'll give you a few. And you, so you have created the SOHO China Scholarship for Harvard and Yale, but I am wondering what your views are on Chinese higher education, and if you are actively involved with improving or reforming Chinese higher education. What I think that when we set out to do this scholarship, we had one thing in mind, which is I reflected back to when I was a financial aid student back in the 80s. Back in the 80s, China had no money. And every one of us, if we had left China, came out to get education, we were bound to be on somebody's generosity was on financial aid. But today, China has economic growth so well. And I see that a lot of the well-to-do families are able to send their children to the best universities around the world. And so in that, I was seeing the missing of the people like me back in the 80s. I was thinking there's got to be a room for these people to be also benefiting from the best education. And that was behind the thinking of setting up this scholarship, the financial aid. And we debated a lot whether we should be starting it at the, a PhD research level, or at the master's level, or at high school level, or at undergraduate level. In the end, we settled at undergraduate because we felt that this is the part where it probably still has maybe the most impactful in terms of forming a person's values. And still the age are still so young and so easy to be influenced, and I think that, so we think that's a good time to not just technically learning a great, getting the great education, but also as a whole human growth. This is a great time, and that's why we have identified to do this program with undergraduate degree.
One of these questions is actually, we started to ask it before. This person asked, what do you think are some of the challenges for urbanization in China today?
Well, the challenge in China's urbanization is we built the cities really fast. We talk about it because of the technology enabling us to do it. And China's city plannings are very much, you have a one planning, it goes to all of the cities. It's not just Beijing and Shanghai, it's all over the cities in China. So we tend to have one type of city. So you don't have the variety of different cities that, that comes from history, culture difference, climate difference, people's, just that is not so apparent in China's urbanization. And I think that's you will see, they all look quite similar, whether you're in Beijing or Shanghai, you're in Guangzhou, you're in Shenzhen, Chongqing, and almost everywhere you will have a CBD, you will have an international airport, you will have an opera house, and then you quite similar in that sense, which I think it's, I'm hoping that over the time, if the city planners allow creativity to really exercise in different cities differently, then we will have a chance to really develop the cities slightly differently. Whereas now it seems to be, too similar and too much a cookie cutter in a way.
Is that because the conditions are similar in all the different places? Because certainly one of the reasons why European cities have a varied face and structure is that it evolved over such a long period of time. So you may have one, the Haussmann Revolution that put this imprint on Paris, but it was built on top of something else. And then comes another period, and there's an accretion over time. And what we see in China these last 20 years was this demolishing of what was there in many cases, and then put up everything at once. Do you think that?
I think that's something to do with the time,
yeah.
the density, the intensity of the building time, so short and all happening at the same time. And also to do with our planning policy. Because if we had allowed different planning policies for different type of cities, we would see a very different types. But we don't. We have one type of planning, urban planning, for almost all the cities in China.
What about imitation? Do you have this, what I've observed in a few places, I'm quite surprised when I go to another city to find out, oh, that is exactly the same building. So sometimes I wonder if in the so-called second-tier cities, whether there's actual direct modeling on a business center or a mall that they found was really the height of modernity in Shanghai and Beijing, and then they replicate it. Does that go on?
Yeah, no, we see a lot of that. I want to tell you a funny story, because we were in one of the buildings that showed in the video. It was like the three mountains, right? As we were building it, and then somebody told me, oh, there's actually a replica of this already built in Chengdu, I was like, oh my God, these guys were faster than us. How did that happen? So then, and turned out that, somehow this, drawings and designs are just, these days everything is on internet, right? So then some developer liked it and decided that, okay, we'll copy, slightly change, a little rounder, not as artistic, but nevertheless, it was a replica. And we, in the beginning, we were really upset. The architects were really upset. They wanted to, sue them and so on. But then we ended up not doing too much of that. And, we just focus on, continue with what we do rather than focus too much on the cracking down the replicates.
I was wondering, this is a question about the space, it's not one that the students asked, was about time. One of the things that I observed was the way in which the buildings, your buildings in particular, where I did observations, have one life in the daytime and have another life in the evening. And I was wondering if that was intentional, whether when you're planning, whether you imagine a temporal transformation of a building over a day.
Yeah, I think the most important part that worries all of us is that cities are built, cities are planned not mixed enough. Mm-hmm. Like offices, all offices, and this is all residential, this is all office. So then you will have these, during the day there are a lot of people in the office, and then at night it's like quiet and nothing. And so it doesn't mix enough, and that's usually the trouble, because I think that was, city planners by now all realize that's a problem, but so much of it is already earlier planned and built. And so I think the city planners, when you talk to city planners, they all talk about, what do we need to do to make this area, the CBD area, more lively at night? It's hard, this cannot be artificially done. It has to be, you need to mix, people live there, and then naturally at night there will be people. But I think that it just wasn't enough thinking at the time.
Well, one of the last slide, when she's in Shanghai, I was thinking when we were there in that exact place in front of where that building is, we spent many hours while our son was taking photographs of the river. And I actually found it very organic and animated. That's why I asked the question. I think actually, as I experienced it in Shanghai recently, it really works. I think, and the river is one of the reasons that it pulls it together.
Yeah.
And the number of people who are drawn there and interact around your building is very striking. And so that's why I was asking whether in the design, as you're going forward, if you are explicitly engaged in building spaces and buildings that have this daytime, nighttime life. Because I think the US is the most extreme situation of the downtown that's dark. It hasn't always been that way, but, and then people move to the suburbs. That's what should I say, the price of the automobile revolution for the United States. But we don't see that in Europe. I mean, in places where land is more expensive, I think there is more integration.
Yeah.
And it's one of the things I always enjoy about living in China, actually. So I was just curious about the explicit aspect in the design. Right. Do you have more questions there that jump out at you?
I think that's
those
about
are the ones
it. Yeah. That's, well, I don't know.
Well, there are quite a few here that are asking you more, I think, about more critically, sort of, what is it that you, I'll put it positively, but what do you admire about Chinese education, and what do you admire about US education? I think one of my questions, as you saw it, because of who I am and what I do, is I am very interested in how what happens in China and our experience of working in China will affect and change our lives here. So in terms of education, one of our friends has created a new company. There's a Chinese branch and there's an American branch. And it is using games and coordinated with also physical education to help children learn better. And this is a joint project, and it's very interesting to watch it develop in these two countries. It's the same product. It's called Activate, and it's developed here by Bruce Wexler, who's a neuroscientist, psychiatrist, and he has a Chinese company and an American company. And it's been absolutely fascinating to see how the same product in these two different environments is evolving. Who wants to purchase it? Who is using it? So in my own work, and in this particular project, what fascinates me is how innovation in China impacts what we do in the United States. And I keep pushing there, and I'm not sure that's where you want to go, but it's something that fascinates
I think
me.
in China, we often, I would hear people say that, oh, you know, our education system fails in promote innovation and creativity. You know, I hear this a lot,
Yes.
and I'm not sure that's entirely true. Well, to
No,
start with,
of
I
course
have
not.
not been, you know, educated in Chinese higher education, you know, university, so I don't really know firsthand. But from my own experience of managing the company and living and working in China, what I can see is that so much of the, let's say, internet products, right? You know, because it's very easy to see that, you know, maybe Weixin, for instance, was not quite originally invented technologically in China, and yet its adaptation of usage and its functionality, it's so much evolved and so much developed in China. That is due to China's own creativity. So I think that almost in every country, in every product you do, there's some elements of that. So I think to completely reject Chinese education, say, oh, this is really have no creativity, it's not quite there. Now, of course, we wish the Chinese education can be as, you know, creative as, let's say, the best education in the U.S. But we, of course, also have a very different culture background. And, you know, I often joke about, you know, like, I don't know if you can have a Chinese classroom which have typically 50 to 70 students all speak like American classroom, which typically have 10, 15 students, right? Everyone is encouraged to talk. But can you imagine a classroom with 70 people, everyone talks like American students? That was just not going to happen. So I think a lot of it is a different style and different culture background inevitably results in that.
Of course. But I was wondering if you see things that, well, I should say, because my experience in China is I see a lot of very exciting and creative individuals, and I'm struck by many aspects of their talents and their drive, which is incubated and shaped by their experience in China. The U.S. is an extremely diverse place, and our education system is comparably diverse. But I'm really thinking about, because I'm moving back and forth, what it is that I see in China in this education field, whether it's the way in which the teachers imagine the lesson, is it the way in which they lead the class? I mean, this is micro, but I think there might be other things. Certainly if we go back to when Americans first went to China as tourists in the 70s, there was definitely a sense among some of these people that they saw something they could study. And one would be example with the barefoot doctor. We can say, yes, there's lots of backstory, but there was an element, I think, of those early travelers who were looking also for something that would change life here in the United States. And so that's where that question was going, is I think that in this area of building, the texture of these new cities, the integration of mass transit and retail of different aspects. I mean, I just love living in Chinese cities. I wouldn't have said that in 1979.
Have you lived in?
I mean, in 1979, you can imagine. Through the 80s, did I love living in a Chinese city? Of course, I love being in China, but it was a very, you know,
Very
no
different.
hot water, no this, no that. Every building was exactly the 5-story walk-up set on the grid, etc. There was very little retail. At night, it went dark. That's one reason why I'm so interested in the light aspect, because it's made a big difference to my understanding. Of course, as a foreigner who doesn't look Chinese, the night was my cloak. And I experienced then my deepest and most open and natural conversations in the dark, in the night, standing waiting for the bus, and it got darker and darker, and then people couldn't see who was talking. And so this is something we know from many settings, but it's been my experience in China. So I am very interested in the way you're designing the buildings, the way you imagine you want to move people through the space, the absence of walls. Let's just be very, in the 70s, China was a walled, whether you went to second tier, third tier, there was a wall. And what was so interesting for me to watch how the walls came down. Right. And now I think China's not a walled city space. And that's very, very important.
China is, growing up in Beijing, there are all the, it's a different compound. You live in a compound, walled compound, and that's quickly disappearing. And I think cities are become quite integrated between the people living there, working there, and visitors. So that's one element is hugely different from the 70s. And I think that China today does not lack a basic residential or office, real estate infrastructure. We have really urbanized the cities. What's going forward is the content that people need to think about is, what are the things that are changing the way people are working, changing the ways people are shopping, changing the ways people are living, and that will very quickly change the buildings, the usage of the buildings.
Do we want another round of questions, or how do you want to proceed? I don't want to monopolize Zhang Xin's. People have more questions or new questions they want to write, and we can also write them on these.
Maybe just ask directly rather than write.
Please raise your hand then if you would like to ask a question. So, I'm not going to call on my students, but do any of you have a question that you want to ask? Yes, in the back on the right.
There's something.
And could you say what your major is? So
sure. I'm in the architecture school.
Architecture.
Yeah. You talked before about the values you see as being important in architecture, I suppose, when you started out, which were digitization.
Can you speak up?
You talked earlier about the values you see as being important in architecture, which were digitization, and you also mentioned globalization. Have they changed? And what are you looking for now when you work with young architects?
I mean, I still think, because when we have a project, usually what we do is we host a competition. And when we will first identify for this site, what kind of architecture would fit better. For instance, if this is a site within a conservation area, then we will go to a certain type of architects. Or if this is in a site that is, really encourage creativity, then we'll go to another type of architects. Usually we host competitions, and then we'll see what architects bring to the competition. Almost always you see that, I see this character of technology, digitalization, changing the way people design and they put forward. And our competitions are always held globally. Like we invite architects around the world, not just Chinese architects, not just Beijing architects. And so that way it's always an interesting way for us to see what really is happening globally, and the latest ideas and the latest design proposals.
Over here, on the side.
Hi, I'm also a student from School of Architecture. I have two questions to ask. When you started your presentation, you mentioned that you believe in architecture as a tool, an agent to initiate social changes, which I feel very encouraged to. But like based on your selection of the architect to design the SOHO offices in Beijing and Shanghai, particularly Zaha Hadid, how do you envision Zaha Hadid's design, which is very futuristic and based on parametric design, represent the future social change in China? Because it doesn't have any roots in Chinese culture, and like I know residents in Beijing responded drastically to the design because it seems so foreignistic in their context. That's my first question. My second question is the Galaxy Soho that got built first. Well, the opening ceremony was a huge success with the interviews between Pan Shiyi and Zaha Hadid. But it turns out that the construction was not meet to the idealistic form that Zaha Hadid designed, and turns out it was not well occupied either. Like when I visited the site, it seems like a lot of the spaces are unoccupied, and the public spaces outside are vacant. So do you see that as not reached to your expectation of what can be achieved? And I wonder, even after the not so successful design of Zaha Hadid in Galaxy Soho, you still decided to choose her as the architect for your next project in Wangjing Soho. And I wonder what's the rationale behind that, because you mentioned that you perceive the architect best suited for the site will get the project. Thank you.
Well, it's been a very sad experience for me that Zaha Hadid passed away this year. She and I worked together for 13 years, and we realized many of her great designs. The opening that you saw on the video was also a lecture given by Zaha, and I think they were Chinese design students were so eager to see her, to meet her, and to see her architecture, so they all came to the opening. I think the Galaxy Soho was a great success. That's why we invited her back. I don't see that as a problem of her design, and the buildings are, the designs are so much loved by people, and that's why we hosted another competition, and she was invited as one of the competitors. She was not awarded the project, but again, she won the competition, and so the Wangjing Soho was built. And today, Wangjing is probably the busiest hub of China's 移动互联网叫什么？叫 mobile internet companies. So I think that what it demonstrates is that actually no matter what kind of design you have, the most important thing is it can adapt to the usage of the people. It can be used by office, it can be used by mobile companies, it can be used by law firms, and it doesn't have to be too, so that's what I consider as a good design that creates the landmark for the city, as the face of the part of the face of the city, but also creates the, can be used by all kinds of tenants, not just one type. So I felt that it's a great loss that I will no longer be able to work with her again since her passed away. And also it's been fortunate, I've been very fortunate to work with her and realize so many of her designs in China. And I think today these projects in China that she designed are probably the largest. If one day, there'll be some PhD students research on her design, these major works of large scales are almost all in China.
My name is Celine, and I'm an undergrad in Yale College. I'm a senior. And I guess my question is, what advice would you have for younger entrepreneurs who have spent most of their education abroad but want to bring their vision back to China?
We see a lot of Chinese grew up in America, went back to China and doing startups, quite a lot. Especially if you walk into Soho 3Q, you see many of these startup companies, with 3 people, 5 people, 20 people, 50 people, and plenty of them were started by overseas Chinese who don't have much experience growing up in China. But I don't think that should be an issue of starting a company in China. As long as the market needs your product, you would bring to the table different things that others don't due to your unique upbringing. I think that's, we see a lot of that in China. That hasn't been an issue at all. Not just Chinese grew up in this country, but even Americans or Europeans who would come to China to do the startup. China is really the land of startup. That's the beauty of it. Its cost of starting up a company is not that high. The cost of living is not that high. That enables young entrepreneurs to go for their dreams. If you go to places like London, for instance, or European cities are so expensive that cost alone would just, push a lot of the entrepreneurial spirit out.
In the middle there, and then there's one in the back.
You would finish after.
Yes, we'll take this one more after this question. So yes.
I'm an undergrad history major. I think one of the issues that a lot of American cities face is spatial segregation by, race or class. Do you think that this is, some Chinese cities also have problems of not really integrating people from all economic backgrounds in the same spaces. How do you see SOHO's role in addressing this problem?
I think one thing that China doesn't suffer is the racial problems, because we are relatively homogeneous society. And yes, there are segregations between social economic backgrounds, but largely I think that segregation is not so much within the city in different places. It's more between rural and China. China, the real divide is between rural and China, not the way that the American cities are experiencing. Right. And I think that's why so much effort has been recently on urbanizing small towns in rural China. And 叫城镇化, what we call 城镇化, not 城市化, it's really to do with small towns in rural China, to really urbanize that and to narrow the gap between rural China and city China, urban China.
The last question was in the back, yes.
Hello, I'm Jack from School of Management. Very glad to be here to hear your fantastic speech. And I'm interested in the affordable housing issues in China, especially in the big cities like Beijing and Shanghai. I worked in the Chinese government before, but I can't afford an apartment in Beijing. So I think how to address this issue, the affordable housing, to make the urban more resilient, and what kind of contribution for the business leader like you can make? Thank you.
I think the housing, Chinese government does have a lot of affordable housing. I'm surprised that you have not been able to get one from There are a lot of 经济实用房, affordable housing, and there are, at one point, it still is the case that, Chinese developers, when you bid a piece of land, it comes with a certain portion of it designated for low-income housing, affordable housing. That continues to be the case. Now, that's one, and maybe that's not enough, and that's probably why you're saying, it's not enough and I cannot afford housing in cities. And now that's another side of the economy, which is you have an economy that is naturally slowing down, and the government are continuously to lose the monetary policy on credit. Therefore, that filled the real estate prices. And that would naturally divide the low-income housing, the affordable housing, and the markedly tradable real estate. I think that's unfortunately the case, and I see this, as long as the loose monetary policy continues to be there, and this phenomena would continue.
Okay, thank you very, very much. This was
Yes, thank you.
very exciting.